Welcome back, everyone, as we continue our look at the Napoleonic Wars from Epic History TV. A little bit of a late start to the day for me. I'm dealing with a nasty cold. You can probably hear it in my voice. I'm a little stuffy and sore throat, but then I had to go ahead and watch my boys from West Brom take another victory, keeping on climbing up that table. Pretty excited for them. But we're going to dive into Napoleon's invasion of Russia today. As always, a link is in the description to the original content. I encourage you to support Epic History TV. They do some amazing work in the history realm of YouTube, as is a link to the beginning of my reaction, which goes back almost 2 years. So if you want to check that out and get caught up to the point where we're at now, let's go ahead and dive in. Invasion of Russia. This is where it continues to go wrong for Napoleon Bonaparte.
Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen. But for the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever encountered. And as winter closes in, his army begins the most infamous retreat in history.
Yeah, so a lot is made of this and how 100+ years later, the same mistake is made by another European army. But honestly, Napoleon gets where he wants to go pretty quickly in all of this. But he's going to end up fighting this massive battle at Borodino, which I was looking, and I think it's in the next episode. But apparently the battlefield's well preserved today, and that's one of those places, hopefully down the road when things calm down politically out there, I'd love to get to.
In 1807, following his defeat of the Russian army at Friedland, Napoleon had travelled to Tilsit to meet the Russian Emperor Alexander. During their celebrated encounter, the two emperors formed a friendship and made an alliance. But it was not to last. Over the next 5 years, relations between France and Russia cooled dramatically. The Russians were irritated by Napoleon's creation of a Duchy of Warsaw in Poland.
There's always fighting going on right over what we know today as Poland. And Poland at one time had been a very powerful, you have the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You've got a really strong kind of buffer here between Russia and Austria and the states of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire at one time. And so this is always going to be one of those areas now that people are going to fight over. And for the next 100 years plus after this, it's going to be kind of the influence between Prussia and Germany later on, and then the Russians. And it seems like Warsaw, the Polish are always at the center of it.
Poland, which they regarded as meddling in their own front yard. They feared it would lead to the return of a fully fledged Polish state, a traditional thorn in Russia's side. Then there was Napoleon's offer to marry Alexander's sister, Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna, to cement their alliance. But the Romanovs hated the idea, and after a year of Russian prevarication, Napoleon married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, instead. Later that year, Napoleon broke a guarantee made at Tilsit and annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, ruled by Alexander's sister's father-in-law. Worst of all was the fallout over the continental system, Napoleon's not very effective economic blockade against Britain, designed to cripple his most steadfast enemy.
It's an interesting thing to try and blockade a country that's got a much more powerful navy than you do. But I understand why he did that. He's trying to put economic pressure on the British, but it's just so much ground to cover, and you're dealing with so many different nations. It was a foolish thing to do. And as you see, these are mistakes that didn't have to happen. These are self-inflicted wounds by Napoleon. He probably could have kept the Russians on his good side and avoided all of this. And honestly, and we've talked about this before, if he just would have known when to stop, right? He probably could have kept a great deal of influence in Europe, and this probably all goes away, and Napoleon probably lasts as French emperor, and maybe sets up a dynasty that to this day is influential in ruling large parts of Europe, but it was not to be.
Alexander had agreed to join the continental system at Tilsit, but it was hugely unpopular in Russia and ruinous to her finances during a period of economic crisis. When Napoleon found out that Russia was flouting the rules of the system and had resumed an illicit trade with Britain, he was furious. With both emperors accusing the other of bad faith, their two countries began preparing for war.
And so here's a breakdown in diplomacy, right? There should have been a solution here. There should have been, Napoleon could have said, okay, listen, I see this as economically really wrecking your country, and I understand, right? Don't go leading a 500,000 man army into a disastrous campaign in Russia. Of course, this is one of those examples of where Napoleon has won so many victories that he starts to think that his armies can do things that they can't do. He starts to think that they're invincible. He starts to think that he can march. I mean, the distance we're talking about, just from the border of Russia to get to Moscow or to St. Petersburg, which is the capital, you're talking about the distance from Russia to Paris. I mean, it's that far. And it's a long way to go. It's a lot of ground to cover, and you've got to deal with supply lines and logistics and being able to, it's not just like you can just march your army in there in a vacuum. You've got to protect the supply lines going all the way back, and communications and all these sorts of things, and it was foolish. See, there it is. We're dealing with many years after Austerlitz now, and he's still saying, hey, we're the army that won this great victory at Austerlitz. Yeah, you are, but this is a different animal. You're not fighting in Central Europe anymore. You're fighting in Russia.
Napoleon knew an invasion of Russia was a massive undertaking, especially as he still had an unfinished war in Spain that was tying down more than 200,000 troops. Nevertheless, in 1811, he began to assemble the largest army Europe had ever seen, around 600,000 men, though less than half of them were French.
And think of what he could have done with that army other than marching it into Russia. There's so many other options he could have had. He could have marched that army into Spain and crushed the opposition that was happening there. He could have just kept them and protected what he already had. There's so many other things that could have happened here.
Around 600,000 men, though less than half of them were French. The rest came from allied states across Europe. There was a Polish corps from the Duchy of Warsaw, led by Prince Poniatowski, a corps from each of the German kingdoms of Saxony, Westphalia, and Bavaria, from the Kingdom of Italy, as well as Swiss, Dutch, Croat, Spanish and Portuguese units scattered throughout the army. There were even contingents from Prussia and Austria, France's recent enemies, now uneasy allies. Some of these allied troops, such as the Poles and Germans, were as reliable as their French counterparts.
So yeah, some of them were, and as you mentioned, some of them are uneasy allies. These are allies who are going to go wherever the wind blows, right? So as long as Napoleon's the one in the position of strength, they'll side with Napoleon. But as we'll see later on, the minute the fortunes of war change, you're going to start to see some of these folks who used to be Napoleon's allies very quickly turn on him, including one of his own marshals.
Others were very inexperienced, or like the Prussians and Austrians, reluctant to be there at all. This gigantic formation was deployed in 3 armies. The main force under Napoleon himself, another led by his stepson, Eugène, and a third led by his younger brother, Jérôme, King of Westphalia. Neither of these two were experienced commanders. Though one would distinguish himself on campaign, the other would not. On their left flank, Marshal MacDonald led 10th Corps with a large Prussian contingent.
And if you're wondering, I don't know a lot about him, but if you have to be wondering, like I did when I first heard it many years ago, how on earth does the French Emperor have a marshal named MacDonald? That's a Scottish name. Well, he does have Scottish roots.
While the right flank was guarded by General Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps. Another 100,000 troops were in reserve, including Marshal Victor's 9th Corps. Initially, the Russians only had 220,000 men to face this juggernaut, organized into Barclay de Tolly's 1st Army, Prince Bagration's 2nd Army, and General Tomasov's 3rd Army. They would be outnumbered 2-1. But in the run-up to war, Russia scored 2 crucial diplomatic triumphs. Sweden had been at war with Russia just 3 years earlier, a conflict which cost her Finland.
Again, we talk about it all the time, right? History doesn't rhyme, or history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Some of the same foes fighting each other over the years, right? We're going to see this happen in World War II, where you're going to have Russia invading Finland in the Winter War. I mean, very few things change over time.
By a curious turn of events, Sweden was now ruled by Napoleon's ex-marshal Bernadotte. But after Napoleon occupied Swedish Pomerania without warning, a furious Bernadotte promised Russia that Sweden would remain neutral. Meanwhile, a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire ended Russia's 6-year war against its southern rival. These 2 agreements secured Russia's flanks from any strategic threat.
And this is huge for Russia, right? Because Russia's so big that the benefit is that means when an enemy attacks, they've got a long way to go. But the challenge is that means you've got a lot of areas to protect. And so if you've secured your flanks, now you can focus everything you've got on dealing with Napoleon up the center.
And freed up troops to face Napoleon's invasion. On the 24th of June 1812, French troops began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. The army was so large, the crossing took 5 days.
And think about the logistics that you have to deal with a 500,000 man army. I mean, it's 3 armies, but 500,000 men. You've got to feed them. You've got to be able to clothe them because they're going to wear out their uniforms and their shoes. You've got to have enough weapons to make sure that they've got ammunition if you fight any battles. I mean, this is a huge logistical undertaking, and you're doing this over hostile territory.
Napoleon's plan was to attack north of the impassable Pripyat marshes and defeat Barclay's army, while Jérôme pinned Bagration in place. French forces would then swing south to trap Bagration. Napoleon expected the campaign to be over in 5 weeks. But the sheer size of the French army convinced the cautious Barclay that retreat was his only option. Prince Bagration, a much more aggressive commander by instinct and often Barclay's fierce critic, was forced to agree. As they withdrew, they burned villages and crops, part of a scorched earth strategy to deny supplies to the enemy.
And as we were just talking about logistics and supply, and this is smart, you are drawing a superior enemy into a situation where his numbers actually work against him, because now he's got this massive force, but he can't feed it. He can't supply it. They're going to have to start stretching out because they're going to have to start foraging, and you're destroying all the places he can forage.
In 4 days, Napoleon had reached Vilnius, but Barclay was gone. To the south, Jérôme failed to pin down Bagration. So when Davout's 1st Corps swung southeast to trap him, he'd already withdrawn to safety. Napoleon's younger brother was out of his depth, stung by the Emperor's criticism, humiliated when his troops were put under Marshal Davout's command. He resigned his post and returned to Westphalia. The campaign was already beginning to expose serious flaws in Napoleon's plan. Knowing his troops would struggle to live off the land in this impoverished region, he'd organized huge supply depots and transport units to feed the army. But wagons rolled slowly along Russia's bad roads, which were turned to rivers of mud by summer thunderstorms. The army had to make frequent stops to allow its supplies to catch up. Bad news for Napoleon's plan to catch the Russians, but a much-needed relief for the many thousands of young conscripts in his army, not used to hard marches day after.
So, if you're the Russians, what are your strengths? The size of your country, the bad roads, the ability with a smaller force to move quicker and to know your own territory, right? So you're using all of your strengths to your advantage, and those things are hurting Napoleon. His big army is slow. His big army needs fed. He's got a lot of conscripts. He's got folks from lots of different nationalities. It means it's going to be difficult to coordinate and to communicate. And his whole strategy revolves around the idea of speed and surprise, and it's already failing. This is where we start dealing with the sunk cost fallacy, right? At what point does Napoleon say this isn't working? Let's back out, let's regroup, let's figure this out. Or does he double down? Well, he doubles down.
Many were soon dropping out with exhaustion. Others deserted. There were also huge problems of command and control over a vast multinational army that was 3 times bigger than any Napoleon had commanded before. La Grande Armée, once famed for its speed of maneuver, had become a lumbering beast. After a pause to rest and regroup at Vilnius, Napoleon resumed his advance. Barclay continued his retreat to Vitebsk, where he hoped Bagration's Second Army would be able to join him. But Davout blocked Bagration's path at Sultanovka, forcing him to make for Smolensk instead. At Vitebsk, Napoleon clashed with Barclay's rearguard, but once more the Russians escaped, after setting fire to all the stores they couldn't take with them.
We've seen this strategy in other wars. The Texans did this against Mexico. Washington did this against the British in the Revolutionary War. You draw them in. I've been saying it. This is what you have to do, and this is perfectly executed by the Russians.
Meanwhile, 300 miles away, on Napoleon's southern flank, Russian Third Army attacked and defeated the Saxon 7th Corps, forcing Napoleon to divert Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps to their aid. By the end of July, Napoleon had advanced 250 miles into Russia, much further than he'd planned.
So you might ask yourself, well, what do you mean much further than he planned? Well, by this point, he's already planned on defeating Russia, right? His whole plan was to surprise them, isolate and destroy one of the armies, defeat another one up here. He's probably thinking we'll force them into negotiation, because he's not trying to conquer Russia. He just wants them to follow his direction as far as not dealing with the British, as far as, being an ally, or at least not getting in his way. He wasn't planning on having to march all the way to Moscow or march to St. Petersburg or to actually defeat the Tsar. Now the plans have changed.
And the long marches in extreme summer heat continued to take a heavy toll on his men. Without fighting a major battle, the army had already suffered 20% casualties.
20% of 500,000 men. I mean, that's crazy numbers. I mean, that's significant. That's a fifth of your army. That's 100,000 men. It's not the winter. It's not bullets or artillery that's doing it.
From exhaustion and illness, particularly typhus and dysentery. The army had entered Russia with 250,000 horses, but they were now dying at a rate of 1,000 every day, from exhaustion and lack of fodder. It wasn't just cavalry horses that were dying, but the very horses that were supposed to haul the army's transport wagons, making a bad situation worse.
And again, in hindsight, it's easy to say this, but at what point do you say, this isn't working, let's get out of here before it gets worse? But Napoleon's overconfident. He's convinced he can still win this.
This crisis in horsepower came just as the French light cavalry, Napoleon's eyes and ears, met their match in Russia's Cossacks. Cossacks, self-reliant, proud, ruthless, and superb horsemen, didn't play by the same rules as other European cavalry. Every day they shadowed Napoleon's army, swooping in whenever they saw an easy target, but melting away into the forests if they were attacked by a stronger force. Cossacks, as well as Russian partisans, made hit-and-run attacks on French supply lines and depots.
And these are the things that you deal with when you're marching deep into enemy territory. You know, I debate with people all the time over the American Civil War when they try to tell me, well, you know, Robert E. Lee had all these disadvantages and Grant had every advantage. Well, no. It is a distinctly unique and difficult challenge to march hundreds of miles into enemy territory, where you have to deal with attacks on your supply lines, and you have to deal with the civilian population, and you have to spread yourself out thin and keep communication lines open. It's a unique challenge,
forcing Napoleon to divert thousands of troops to their defense. Alongside Russian regular light cavalry, they also prevented French patrols from carrying out reconnaissance, which meant that Napoleon often lacked good information about roads or the enemy's whereabouts. Napoleon stayed 16 days at Vitebsk, resting his troops and considering his options. Among his many mounting concerns was the security of his long, exposed flanks. But at Vitebsk, he received news that Schwarzenberg had defeated the Russians at Gorodezhna. A week later at Polotsk, a French Bavarian force fought Wittgenstein's Russian First Corps to a standstill. Napoleon's flanks were secure, for now. Although his main force had been reduced to less than half its original strength, Napoleon decided to push on to Smolensk and try to force the Russians into a decisive battle for the city.
That's what he wants.
Barclay was indeed under pressure to give battle from fellow commander Prince Bagration and Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg. The army's morale and Russia's honor required it, they told him.
What do you want? Do you want honor or do you want victory? Victory means you don't give him the big battle he wants, because you know he'll probably win that, or at the very least, at least gives him a better chance.
With the First and Second Russian armies finally linking up near Smolensk, Barclay decided to attack Napoleon's army, which he believed was concentrated around Rudnya. The offensive was led by General Platov's Cossacks, who surprised a French cavalry division at Inkova. But alarmed by false reports that Eugene's Fourth Corps was outflanking him to the north, Barclay called off the attack. Napoleon, reassured that Barclay's offensive posed no real threat, began a grand outflanking move to the south to take Smolensk and cut off the Russian retreat. The so-called Smolensk maneuver was Napoleon at his best, using Murat's cavalry to screen his movements and keep Barclay in the dark. The Emperor reached the Dnieper on the evening of the 13th of August. His engineers quickly threw up 4 pontoon bridges, and by dawn the next day, his army was across. Marshal Davout led a second column across the river at Orsha. But a single Russian division, the 27th, fought a heroic fighting retreat from Krasny, delaying the French advance and buying time for Bagration to reinforce the Smolensk garrison.
So once again, his element of surprise, his whole tactic to try and get in behind and cut them off, it's not working. We're into mid-August now. You're running out of time to turn back on this thing before you're going to have to deal with winter.
The chance for a surprise assault on the city was lost. And as the Russian army began to pull back, Napoleon displayed an uncharacteristic lack of urgency, even halting the army for a parade to mark his 43rd birthday. When the main attack on Smolensk began 2 days later, Napoleon opted for a frontal assault. 150 French guns battered the city as 3 French corps attacked its medieval fortifications. The Russians resisted bravely, but Barclay, fearing encirclement, ordered another retreat. With Smolensk in flames, the Russians began to pull out. Just as the French fought their way into the city, to scenes of utter devastation. Bagration's Second Army withdrew first. As Barclay's army followed, its rearguard was caught by Ney's Third Corps at Valutino. General Junot, commanding the Westphalian 8th Corps, had orders to cut off Barclay's retreat.
You can see the theme over and over again. We're trying to cut them off and destroy, try to isolate and destroy elements of the army so he's got nothing left to fight with.
But having crossed the river, he did nothing, and the opportunity was lost. A furious Napoleon swore that Junot would never now win his marshal's baton. The Battle of Smolensk cost both sides around 10,000 casualties, and destroyed one of Russia's most historic and holy cities, but settled nothing. After the missed chance to defeat the Russians at Smolensk, Napoleon paused once more to consider his options. His men were weary and far from home, and it was already late in the campaigning season.
Yep.
He considered sitting out the Russian winter at Smolensk and resuming the campaign in 1813.
Might have been a good idea.
But now he was just 230 miles from Moscow.
And again, hindsight's 20/20. It's obvious stuff, right? But it's late August. You're almost into September. Russian winter's going to hit before you know it, and you're still 230 miles away, which is 230 miles further away from home that you're going to be.
A century earlier, Peter the Great had moved Russia's capital to St. Petersburg. But Moscow remained its historic and spiritual heart, a prize for which the Russians had to fight. Napoleon, always a gambler, decided to push on. The Russians faced their own dilemma. Emperor Alexander had experienced a kind of religious epiphany that summer and rallied the Russian people to the country's defense, describing the war with Napoleon as a war to save Holy Mother Russia from the Antichrist. For months, the emperor had received conflicting advice to stand and fight or retreat. Now he decided change was needed. The cautious General Barclay kept his job, but the emperor summoned General Mikhail Kutuzov to take overall command of Russia's armies. Kutuzov had been beaten by Napoleon at Austerlitz 7 years before, but he'd since won several victories against the Ottoman Empire and was a true Russian, loved by the troops.
And here's a guy who suffered defeat in what is arguably Napoleon's greatest victory at Austerlitz. But he's since had success. He's built some confidence, and he is probably eager to get payback. So this is the kind of person you want, somebody who is ready and has the attitude that he's going to take Napoleon down.
Although Kutuzov agreed with Barclay's strategy of delay, he saw that constant retreats were destroying the soldiers' and the nation's morale. If Moscow was given up without a battle, the fallout could be disastrous. And so, 70 miles west of the city, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army prepared to make a stand. Europe was about to witness the bloodiest day's fighting of the Napoleonic Wars.
And that's where we'll be in the next episode, the Battle of Borodino. I was reading about the Battle of Borodino a little bit last week, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it looks like the battlefield's relatively well preserved. There's a lot to see there, and if political circumstances allow at some point down the road, that is definitely a place I would love to visit. So we'll see. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Let's add to the conversation. Let's continue to learn together, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.